Today we begin a new church year. This is the first Sunday of Advent, and we'll be reading from Matthew's Gospel, the 24th chapter, beginning with the 37th verse. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in the field. One will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a handmill, and one will be taken and the other left. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will return. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch, and would not have let his house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. Today's gospel lesson brings to mind visions of what some Christians refer to as the rapture. If you aren't familiar with the concept or the term, rapture is the idea that when Christ comes again, when he returns, the first thing he will do is take all the true believers off the earth in an instant. Suddenly, airplanes may be left without pilots, and cars might be rendered driverless. People will vanish from their work cubicles and construction sites and production lines. From our text, then 2 men will be in the field. One will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and one left. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. According to rapture theology, the unfaithful people will be left behind for a time of tribulation, where the forces of good will battle for the remnant of the earth over the forces of evil. Those who are snatched up in the rapture will be spared all the suffering from the ensuing Armageddon. Many of the ideas that compose rapture theology are drawn from Daniel and Revelation and a verse out of 1 Thessalonians. Varying groups differ, sometimes greatly, on the details of the nature of the rapture and the tribulation, but all those who subscribe to rapture theology seem to agree on one thing: it's best not to be left behind. Now, as a young person, I was exposed to this kind of theology, not so much through the Lutheran church of my childhood, but rather through the charismatic and Pentecostal churches I had gravitated toward as a teenager. My young imagination was filled with fearful dreams, either of waking up one day to find my parents and most of the people I cared about gone, while I was left alone in a world full of chaos and imminent doom. I also experienced the reverse kind of vision as well, where I was the one about to be raptured, and it was explained to me that many of the people I loved would have to be left behind because they did not believe, or at least did not believe properly. I am told that these kinds of fears are not uncommon for people raised with rapture theology. The popularity of the 16 best-selling novel series Left Behind, with tens of millions of copies sold and spawning seemingly innumerable sequels and several motion pictures, shows us just how prevalent the notion of rapture is in American culture. And rapture theology can give us a window into what people think about God. Does God really want us to have a fearful understanding? To live perpetually in fear? To always be wondering, will I make the grade? Will my family and friends make the grade? Or will I, or they, have to endure the tribulation, hoping against hope to overcome the impending evil? Truly, there seems to be something missing from all this. Compassion. Love. Somehow the God who would run the universe this way doesn't seem very much like the Abba, Jesus, and we worship. But then, how different is rapture theology from a typical understanding of being saved, of getting into heaven or not? Who gets to go to heaven? Will I get in? Will my friends and family be there? What if I slip up between now and the time I die? What if I'm caught by surprise by death without having repented first? What if I have doubts along the way? Rapture theology, being saved? Either way, is this really what a loving God intends? Let's look at our text a little more closely. Traditional rapture theology suggests that being taken is a good thing, and being left behind is really, really bad. But if we look at the text from a linguistic perspective, we see that, as so often happens, things may not be how we first imagine them. Matthew 24:38 through 39 says, "For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark, and they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away. So too will be the coming of the Son of Man." The Greek word translated as swept away, aro, generally means taken up, carry away, or remove. It has very similar connotations as that of being taken up in the rapture. That being the case, couldn't we say that according to this verse, those in the flood experienced a kind of rapture, being carried away in it? Which would mean that it was only Noah and his family who were left behind after the floodwaters receded. Again, Matthew 24:40 through 41 reads, "Then two will be in the field. One will be taken and one left behind. Two women will be grinding meal together. One will be taken and one left behind." The word for left is apheami, which can mean, among other things, to send off or let go. It can also mean to divorce. The most common meaning is to abandon or leave behind, but then again it can also mean to let go or leave in peace. And it can mean to forgive, to pardon, or to cancel debt. So, what might we take from the juxtaposition of the two images, the swept away of verse 39 and the being left in verse 41? Typical rapture theology promulgates that it's really best to be carried away and decidedly undesirable to be left. But if one takes the Noah reference seriously, doesn't the opposite actually make more sense? In the days of Noah, everyone else was swept away, except for Noah and his family. They were the only ones left behind by the flood. They were the ones left in peace, safely contained in the ark. I would suggest that a careful reading of these verses would in fact portray something much the opposite of typical rapture theology. And of course that begs the question, what does that mean for us? Beyond what might seem like nothing more than a literary or linguistic trick, Okay, so it's actually better to be left behind than caught up. But what difference does that really make? And here again, we must look to the words of Jesus for our understanding. The authors of Matthew have Jesus saying, "For as in the days of Noah, before the flood." Now, according to Genesis, what were these days of Noah, the days leading up to the great deluge? Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 through 6 tell us, "The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time." And in verses 11 through 12 we read, "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on the earth had corrupted their ways." Now here it might be helpful to understand that along with theologian James Allison and many others, I recognize the story of Noah as another kind of creation story. Perhaps not as obvious as the creation stories in the first chapters of Genesis, but nonetheless one that is very typical of ancient peoples, the present creation having been brought forth out of some period of chaos. In this case, the chaos of supreme violence and moral corruption. And that would bring us to what I believe Jesus' point is. We can relate this story of Noah to the coming of the Son of Man, of which Jesus speaks, in two ways. Firstly, the people of Noah's day were swept away by their own violence, carried away by it to the point where it wasn't controllable. It became a raging sea. The only people left out of this, apparently, were Noah and his family. Why? At least according to the story, because they looked to God. Noah, we are told, walked with God. On the other hand, we may also look at the physical part of the story, the deluge or flood itself. The people carried away by their own violence were also ultimately swept away by the rising waters, caught unaware. Only Noah and his family, and of course the animals, were left out, abandoned, as it were, by the torrent, but nonetheless left in peace and safety. A kind of rapture? Perhaps. But certainly a rupture in time. Violence escalates until it becomes a storm, a torrent, a deluge of hatred, and only those who hear the voice of God, who hear his call to live lives of radical peace, who are aware of God's call in their lives, have any chance of not being swept away in the tide. In the words of Tom Truby from Preaching Peace, the Bible does not so much describe a coming rapture as it describes an already come rupture in time and history. The endless cycles of human violence have been exposed and interrupted with an incarnate, non-violent word from God in Christ Jesus. A word spoken from the cross where Jesus prays, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing." It is a rupture. It begins creation again with the power of life from God that reveals itself as more powerful than our powers of violence and death. We who are already baptized into that promise of life don't need to hope in some future rapture. Perhaps rapture, but more to the point, many ruptures, interruptions throughout history, again and again. The deluges of hatred and greed and violence wash over humanity, and unaware, the people are carried away by it. Generally, only a few left out. It happened again in Jesus' day. Perhaps we could argue he was the only one left behind, that everyone else was carried away with violence. In one sense, maybe Jesus is the only one who is never, on some level, carried off by violence. Yet we are told there will come a day. Perhaps the cycle of violence will happen 100,000 times more before the wheel finally comes to rest. But there will come a day, in the words of Isaiah, that the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many peoples shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountains of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. The day will arrive when God shall adjudicate between the nations, deciding disputes for many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. Until then, we are called to stand firm, to be aware, to heed the call to radical, unyielding peace, so that we may not be among those who are swept away by violence, but rather we may be the ones who are left, even if by being left we are brought to our own crosses, to our own Gethsemanes, living in, with, and through Christ, empowered by his Holy Spirit, we are not swept away.